Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. Now guys, before we start today's video, I need to ask all of you watching this video a question. Do you all think that if you were somehow able to find a seat in one of the RMS Titanic's all too few lifeboats, you would be guaranteed to survive the sinking of the Titanic? Well, if your answer was yes, I have to tell you, it all depends on which lifeboat you got into. You see, which lifeboat you got into really does play a major factor in determining if you're going to survive the disaster or not. Now, while it is true that most of the lifeboats launched from the Titanic that evening were perfectly safe boats, they may have been a little chilly in them, but that's all because of the weather outside. It was freezing cold. But the conditions in the boats were perfectly fine to survive the Titanic. However, there was one boat that was launched from the Titanic who, the conditions in this boat were so bad that I would argue that if you were in this boat, you weren't that much better off than if you were simply adrift in the freezing cold North Atlantic Sea. That's how bad the conditions in this boat were. Now, if I was to ask all of you watching this video, what boat do you think I'm talking about? Well, I'm sure many of you out there would think I was talking about Collapsible Lifeboat B, which, due to the fact that the crew was in such a hurry to try to get this boat away from the Titanic before it sank, this boat ended up accidentally flipped upside down. And those that were surviving on this boat basically had to climb on top of the thing and just balance the boat left and right to try to keep themselves out of the water. You see, the trick in surviving the sinking of the Titanic is keep yourself out of the water, because the human body it cannot survive very long in water that's 28 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 2 degrees Celsius. I mean, I can't even imagine how terrible that must have been. But honestly, even though the conditions on Collapsible Lifeboat B were bad, I would argue it was basically a pleasure cruise when you compare it to the lifeboat that I'm going to be discussing in today's video. You see, in today's video, we're going to be talking about Collapsible Lifeboat A, a lifeboat that, for whatever reason, people really don't talk about it all that much among the Titanic community. But you see, the conditions in this boat were so bad that most of the people who got away from the Titanic in this boat died before another lifeboat came to pick them up. That's how bad everything was in this lifeboat. So join me in today's video as we talk about Collapsible Lifeboat A, the worst lifeboat to be in when you're trying to survive the sinking of the Titanic. So before I can tell you why the conditions in Collapsible Lifeboat A were so bad for everybody who was in it, we first need to talk about how this lifeboat ended up leaving the Titanic. Because, you see, the way that this lifeboat left the Titanic is directly responsible for how come the conditions in this boat were so bad, and why it was so hard for anyone to survive the sinking of the Titanic in this lifeboat. You see, the Titanic's crew attempted to launch Collapsible Lifeboat A very close to the end of the Titanic's life. And the reason they waited so long to begin working on Collapsible A was due to the fact that the boat was stored in a place on board the Titanic that made it not easily accessible to the Titanic's crew. You see, unlike all of the other lifeboats that were stored on the Titanic, which were stored at a perfectly good spot on the Titanic's boat deck, right beside the ship's side so they were easy to lower away, Collapsible Lifeboat A was stored on the roof of the officers' quarters right here, right beside the first funnel on the starboard side. And because this boat was up on the roof of the officers' quarters, the Titanic's officers first had to get rid of all of the lifeboats right along the ship's side right there to make room for Collapsible A. And then they had to get Collapsible A down from the roof of the officers' quarters down to the regular boat deck, where they could then attempt to attach it to the Titanic's davits and lower it over the ship's side. So because it was so involved to get this boat ready, this is the reason why the Titanic's crew waited until it was one of the last, if not the last, lifeboat on the Titanic before they attempted to work on this boat and get it ready for launch. Now, the Titanic's crew began working on Collapsible Lifeboat A at some point between 2:05 and 2:10 a.m. And the reason they waited till quite literally the last minute to begin working on Collapsible Lifeboat A is because even at this late stage in the sinking, there is still one lifeboat left that needs to be launched on the starboard side, and that lifeboat is directly in the way of getting Collapsible A ready for launch, and that would be Collapsible Lifeboat C. The lowering away process for this lifeboat began at roughly 2:02 a.m., and they had a difficult time launching this boat because, due to the Titanic's very sharp list to port, this lifeboat kept rubbing up against the Titanic's side as they were lowering this boat away. So they had to be very careful that they didn't accidentally capsize this boat and throw its occupants into the sea. However, the Titanic's crew was successful in lowering Collapsible Lifeboat C over the ship's side, and once they were done, they immediately began work on getting Collapsible Lifeboat A down from the roof of the office quarters and down to the boat deck, where they could then attach it to the Titanic's lifeboat davits and attempt to lower it over the ship's side. Now, when the Titanic's crew began working on prepping Collapsible Lifeboat A, they quickly realized that they had a problem that they needed to solve. They weren't sure how to successfully get Collapsible Lifeboat A down from the roof of the officers' quarters and down to the boat deck without damaging the boat. You have to remember, these lifeboats are extremely heavy, and it's not a good idea to simply just push them off the side of the officers' quarters and let them free fall down to the boat deck. You could severely damage the lifeboat if you did this. However, they didn't exactly have a lot of time to try to figure out a solution because, as I said, they started working on Collapsible Lifeboat A at somewhere between 2:05 and 2:10 a.m. And remember, the Titanic foundered at 2:20. So they really don't have a lot of time to come up with a solution. What they ended up doing was they took a bunch of lifeboat oars and they basically made a primitive ramp of sorts. And they put these oars right up against the side of the officers' quarters. And then they pushed Collapsible Lifeboat A over the side, trying to use these lifeboat oars to successfully slide the lifeboat down and onto the boat deck. Now, they were successful in getting Collapsible Lifeboat A down from the roof of the officers' quarters and down to the boat deck. However, in the process, these oars ended up snapping and the lifeboat basically free fell down to the boat deck. However, it did land right side up and everything, and as soon as this lifeboat hit the boat deck, the crew immediately attached this lifeboat to lifeboat number 1's lifeboat davits right around here and began to prep this boat for launch. Now, the Titanic's crew got Collapsible A down from the roof of the officers' quarters at roughly 2:13, 2:14 a.m., slightly ahead of where this animation is playing right now. But as soon as this boat hit the boat deck, people started scrambling to try to get into this lifeboat before the boat was even in its correct position. And you see, the crew didn't realize that they really didn't have that much time left to prep and launch this boat because the Titanic was literally about to sink out from underneath them. And when they went and attached this lifeboat to the lifeboat number 1 davits, they did not yet realize it, but they had just put this lifeboat in mortal danger. Now, the reason why it was so dangerous for the Titanic's crew to attach Collapsible Lifeboat A to the lifeboat number 1 davits was due to the fact that the Titanic was literally just minutes from sinking out from underneath them. And if this lifeboat was attached to those davits, then as the Titanic continued to sink, it would literally drag Collapsible Lifeboat A down with it. Now, you're probably wondering, why on earth would they have attached this boat to those davits with the ship literally about to sink out from underneath them? Why wouldn't they just let the boat sit there and float away as the Titanic sank? Well, I have a theory, and I think it was due to the fact that the Titanic was listing so far to port. You see, the more observant among you may have noticed in that animation that at the exact moment that Collapsible Lifeboat A touched the boat deck on the starboard side, on the opposite side of the ship, at the exact same part of the ship, just on the opposite side, all of this part of the boat deck was already underwater. And this is because of the Titanic's list to port. So what I think may have happened was the crew on the Titanic's starboard side may not have realized how short on time they were. That may have been why they attached Collapsible A to lifeboat number 1's davits. They simply thought that they had more time because their part of the boat deck was still completely dry. However, it wouldn't take very long for them to find out that they just made a critical mistake. At roughly 2:15 a.m., while the Titanic's crew on the starboard side was still struggling to get Collapsible A pulled up and over the Titanic's side so they could lower the lifeboat away. Oh, and while they were doing this, more and more passengers were jumping into the boat as well, which was making their life more difficult. The Titanic was about to do something unexpected. At 2:15 a.m., the Titanic's port list suddenly evened out, and as a result of this, it sent a massive tidal wave over the Titanic's starboard side boat deck, lifting up Collapsible Lifeboat A, which at this point tried to float away from the Titanic. However, due to the fact that this lifeboat was still tied onto the Titanic's davits, the Titanic was now beginning to drag Collapsible Lifeboat A and all of those in it down into the sea with the Titanic. You see, as the Titanic continued to founder, and as the ship dragged Collapsible Lifeboat A deeper and deeper into the water, the Titanic's crew was scrambling to cut the ropes to free Collapsible Lifeboat A from these lifeboat davits. They simply couldn't release the ropes because the ropes have to be relaxed. They can't be under strain in order to release them. But as the Titanic continued to sink, it was putting more and more strain on the ropes, so they simply could not free Collapsible Lifeboat A from these davits without cutting the ropes. So the crew is scrambling to do this, and all the while, this lifeboat is going deeper and deeper into the water. And just before the lifeboat was dragged so deep into the water that water was about to spill in over the top of the lifeboat and flood the boat, the crew was successful in cutting Collapsible Lifeboat A free of the Titanic. Now, when this happened, this lifeboat, which is still 100% buoyant, it was just being dragged underwater by the Titanic, this caused this lifeboat to suddenly shoot straight up out of the water like a rocket. And when this happened, it dumped all of the people, or nearly all the people that were in this boat, into the sea. The lifeboat basically rolled completely onto its side, and people were scrambling and being dumped into the water. It was absolute chaos. Now, eventually, the lifeboat did settle back into the water, and it righted itself, and people began to try to scramble into this boat. But as a result of all of this going on, so much seawater had gotten into the lifeboat that if you were in this lifeboat and you were standing straight up, the water in this boat basically went up to your knees. And don't forget, this is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius water. So, it was an absolute nightmare of a lifeboat to be in, given everything that just happened. And of course, everyone in this boat had no way to get that water out. Now, at this point, the Titanic is beginning to drop like a rock. Those in Collapsible Lifeboat A could look to their left and see the Titanic's massive first funnel coming up right beside them. However, Collapsible Lifeboat A is slowly but surely drifting away from the Titanic. However, before this lifeboat was completely clear of the ship, all of those in the boat suddenly heard a strange snapping sound coming from the first funnel. You see, the strange sound that everyone in Collapsible Lifeboat A could hear coming from the Titanic's first funnel were all the support cables helping hold this funnel to the Titanic beginning to fail. One by one, these cables snapped, and then everyone in Collapsible Lifeboat A looked in horror as they could see the Titanic's first funnel slowly but surely falling forward and to starboard, directly towards Collapsible Lifeboat A. The first funnel hit the water and missed Collapsible Lifeboat A by inches. Right after the first funnel hit the water, it sent a massive wave towards Collapsible Lifeboat A, which pushed this lifeboat completely clear of the Titanic. However, the resulting wave washed even more freezing cold water into the already partially filled Collapsible Lifeboat A, making the situation for all of those in this lifeboat even more dire. Now, despite the fact that the conditions in Collapsible Lifeboat A were absolutely terrible for all of those who were in that boat, the lifeboat was successfully pushed away from the rapidly sinking RMS Titanic. Now, all of those people in that lifeboat could do nothing except try to keep themselves from freezing to death in the water that was within the lifeboat. And all the while, the RMS Titanic was breaking apart and sinking directly in front of them. Then, at 2:20 a.m., the RMS Titanic slowly but surely slipped beneath the surface, plunging everyone who was still on board the ship into the freezing cold North Atlantic Sea. Now, even though all of those people who did successfully make it into Collapsible Lifeboat A were successful in surviving the initial sinking of the RMS Titanic, their chances of surviving in this lifeboat until they would be eventually rescued is far from certain. Just try to imagine what all of these people were going through. They're in water that is up to your knees, probably a little bit higher, that is freezing cold. Their clothing is completely drenched, from that big wave that came over the lifeboat as the first funnel fell. And all of these people are freezing cold. They can't sit down in the boat because they'll be too deep in the water. Their only choice is to stand there. Can you just imagine how terrible this must have been for all of them. And also, don't forget, this water is 28 degrees Fahrenheit or -2 Celsius. I mean, I can't even put into words how terrible this was. Now, when Collapsible Lifeboat A left the Titanic, it's estimated there were around 30 people in the boat. There were more people. Some estimates think that there was around 40 people in the boat before it semi-flipped after they had to cut it free from the Titanic's davits during the final stages of the sinking. But after all of that happened and all the people who got thrown from the boat scrambled back in, there was around 30. So they lost 10 people when the boat semi-flipped. However, as the evening continued to drag on, those 30 people that were still in the boat, well, the numbers continued to drop one by one as those people fell victim to the cold. By the time lifeboats 4 and 14 came to look for survivors of the Titanic disaster, Lifeboat 14 spotted Collapsible Lifeboat A and quickly rushed over to help. But by the time the people in Collapsible Lifeboat A got transferred over to lifeboat number 14, there were only 10 to 12 survivors. I mean, I can't even put into words how terrible this must have been. I mean, now all of you watching this video now understand why this was truly the worst lifeboat to be in on the night the Titanic sank. Now, leading up to the point that the Collapsible Lifeboat A survivors were picked up by lifeboat number 14, as the people within the boat died one by one, the people who were still alive within the boat simply let their bodies float away in the Atlantic. You know, when you have a boat and it's semi-flooded and you're just trying to keep it stable and you're fighting to stay alive yourself, you're not really going to deal with, trying to keep bodies in a boat. It's a lot safer to let the bodies drift away. That way the boat won't be so deep in the water. It's easy to keep the boat stable and so on and so forth. However, when the survivors of Lifeboat A were transferred to lifeboat number 14, they noticed that there were 3 people within the boat that had passed away that they simply hadn't noticed leading up to their rescue. So what the survivors of Lifeboat A did was they just simply left those bodies in Collapsible A. They pushed the lifeboat away from 14, and then lifeboat 14 took them back to where all the other lifeboats from the Titanic were at. And if you thought the story of Collapsible Lifeboat A was now over, well, guess what? The story of Collapsible Lifeboat A is not over. In fact, something else would happen with Collapsible A around 1 month after the Titanic sank. Now, around 1 month after the Titanic went down, another White Star Line ship, the RMS Oceanic, was sailing across the Atlantic. And when it was around 200 miles or so away from where the Titanic went down, the crew on board the Oceanic spotted a lifeboat floating off in the distance. The Oceanic stopped its engines and they lowered one of its lifeboats and had the crew in that boat go in and investigate this random lifeboat that they found floating in the Atlantic. When they got to the lifeboat, they discovered to their horror that it was a lifeboat from the Titanic. And they also discovered 3 bodies within this lifeboat. This was Collapsible Lifeboat A, and the 3 bodies they found within the boat were the 3 people who had died on the night that the Titanic sank, that the survivors of Collapsible A simply let drift away after they were transferred from Lifeboat A into lifeboat number 14. Boy, I tell you, can all of you watching this video just imagine what that must have been like for all those on board the Oceanic when they found this lifeboat drifting in the Atlantic? And can you also imagine what they must have thought when they realized that this boat came from Titanic and the fact that it still had victims of the Titanic disaster within the boat? I mean, I can't even imagine what it must have been like. And the Oceanic's crew did retrieve the bodies and they brought them aboard. But when they were doing this, they found a Titanic artifact at the bottom of the boat that tells another heartbreaking story. You see, what they found was a wedding ring. And what this wedding ring was, or who this wedding ring belonged to, well, there's a story about it that comes from a survivor who survived Collapsible A, whose name was August Winterstorm. And he mentioned that he saw this husband and wife struggling for life within the boat. He saw the husband within the boat, and then he saw him hanging on to his wife. Now, he said that the husband was kind of laying, kind of sitting, kind of floating within the boat. It's a little bit unclear given how much water was in the boat, but the man wasn't standing up. He was simply laying within the boat, and he was hanging on to his wife, who didn't have the strength to get into the boat. She was simply in the water right beside Collapsible A, and he was just using all of his strength to hang on to her, and she couldn't get in the boat, it was terrible. And nobody within the boat could help her because they were doing everything they could just to keep the boat stable. You know, when you've got all these people standing up in a partially submerged boat, it's everything you can do just to keep the boat from flipping, and it's also a fight just to stay alive. August said that he saw the woman slowly pass away due to the cold, and once she did, her husband let go of her and she floated away. And then not long after she died, her husband died as well. And right before the people in the boat put his body into the water and let it float away, August noticed that his wedding ring slid off his finger and went to the bottom of the boat. This is the ring that the crew of the Oceanic found when they were retrieving the bodies from Collapsible Lifeboat A. Boy, guys, let me just tell you, like, don't get me wrong, the entire story of the Titanic is absolutely heartbreaking. But the story of Collapsible Lifeboat A, it's definitely up there with one of the saddest stories I've heard from the evening, especially the story about the husband and wife who didn't make it and how they found their wedding ring and all that. I mean, it's just absolutely heartbreaking. Anyway, to all of you who are still watching this video up to this point, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And you know what, guys? Let's all do our part to try to keep the memory of everyone in Collapsible A and everybody who was on board the Titanic alive, because that's the best thing we can do to honor all of those people who were there that terrible, terrible night, is just to learn their stories and, you know, treat their stories with respect and help keep their memory alive. Anyway, guys, this is Sam from Historic Travels. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a great night, everybody.